For the next few minutes, we would like for you to join us for a free-ranging discussion about educational methods in the United States today, and particularly about some innovative things that have been and are being done now in college instruction. I have with me three educators today, and from your left to right, we have Dr. Terrell, who has done his research with Joe Hill on cognitive style mapping. And immediately to his left, we have Sam Postlethwait, who has originated a system of learning called audio tutorial instruction. And to my immediate left, I have Dave Roper, who is one of the pioneers in what we call a personalized system of instruction. And with that sort of an introduction, I think maybe we'd just sort of like to talk about where we're coming from with some of these kind of things, and we're going to put a lot of the weight on you, Sam, because we're interested in your philosophy. And I'd kind of like to know, how does somebody who comes from Allister Ridge, West Virginia, get to where he has such an innovative attitude toward learning?
Well, maybe it's because that's where I started teaching. Actually, I started teaching in Hickory Knob, West Virginia, a one-room schoolhouse, and there we had individualized instruction because I only had one student in each class, and I think that I learned an awful lot about people and about teaching there in that situation. I learned to appreciate that students are a lot like people, and they want to be successful, and that they like to tell people what they've learned, and a whole lot of things that I'm finding out as I read some of the educational psychologists are fundamentally sound things.
You were telling me before we got on tape here about a little girl in that one-room schoolhouse. I think that's a wonderful story. Would you share that with us?
Yeah, you bet. I'll never forget this little girl. In this setting, I did everything just like I had seen done earlier, and that is, I had a minute and a half for 8th grade reading and 2 minutes for 7th grade spelling. Actually, I had two students in the 7th grade and that sort of thing. And when it came time to give out the report cards at the end of the session, end of the first 6 weeks, I did this in a very formal way, even though I had only 15 students. I walked around and handed them their report card in a very formal way. And as I went back toward the front of the building, I felt this tug on my coat, and I turned around, and here was this little blonde, blue-eyed girl, and she had a report card, and she said, "Look here, Mr. Postlethwait." She said, "I made an A." Well, of course, I knew she'd made an A. I'd given it to her, but I realized right then how important it is for people to be successful. And the significant thing, I think, here is that the design of instruction, as we've become kind of institutionalized, is not designed for success. In fact, an awful lot of us who teach have become kind of oriented to and concerned about how many people we fail, and more concerned about how many people we fail than how many students are successful here. And some of our really good friends tend to design their instruction around the numbers that they expect to fail. And I think the Keller plan, I think the audio tutorial system, and I think the cognitive style, all of these things are to ask a different question. How do we help people become successful learners, rather than how do we have a certain percentage of failures?
Well, that's one of the things when I tell people about PSI, the biggest reward, we talk about rewarding people in PSI, the biggest reward is the success that someone has, and the fact that you recognize that success, and they recognize it. Exactly. And there's just no bigger reward than success itself.
Yes. And then the striking thing, the interesting thing to me is that my first encounter with that was back in a little country school as a teacher, 18 years old, teaching some 15 students.
Well, if you really think about it, though, your first encounter was probably back in your own youth.
I suppose.
I think if all of us thought about it, that would be the case.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, would you kind of react to that success line as an underlying sort of thing?
Well, I think the thing that I'm pulling out of this is Sam and Dave's attitude toward the learner as being very positive. And in cognitive style, we're trying to really find out more about the learner as an individual. And we're nowhere nearly as accomplished as these gentlemen and their systems that they're talking about, in the sense that we're still looking for how to get this information. But in the cognitive style methodology, they employ elements of both audio tutorial and PSI and many other systems. And the real distinction is the fact that we're trying to devise tests and measurements to get at who is the student, what are their characteristics, and hopefully help Sam and help Dave as they relate to their classes, and through knowing more about their students can design better instruction.
You bring up a good point there about the doing it end of the thing, and I'd like to come back to you, Sam, on this. The philosophy is good, and your students are a lot like people, and I enjoyed the article you wrote that had that as a title. But would you share with us a little bit about how you sort of put this into practice, the nuts and bolts of making this kind of thing work? In other words, you have your system and it's well known, but I think some of your own expression of how it works would help us.
Well, if we ask what is the fundamental issue, or what is the fundamental question, what is the fundamental problem, if indeed we want students to be successful, we have to look at how they become successful learners. Most of us accept the definition of learning as a change that is brought about in the learner. The learner is now able to do something they were not able to do before. And so we're asking the question, how can we bring about this change in the learner? Now, if indeed the change is to be brought about in the learner, then the learner must be involved in the process. And so where do we start designing instruction? We start designing instruction around involvement of the learner, not around the delivery of information. Most of us who teach tend to think in terms of how we deliver information rather than how do we get the learner involved with activities or the design of activities that will cause this learner now to know things that they didn't know before, or to be able to do things that they weren't able to do before. And by your analysis then of the learner, so that you can look at the learner and say the learner is able to do these kinds of things, one then ought to be able to better design learning activities to accomplish or achieve certain ends or goals here. And so we're saying then that we're starting at quite the opposite end of the spectrum. I don't know whether it's unfortunate or not, but the unfortunate thing, it seems to me, is that indeed human beings do learn vicariously, and when information is delivered to a human being will identify with this from their past history and consequently experience things vicariously and consequently learn. And so we've built on that until we've gotten so far away from the fundamental issue that we really don't get back and say, all right, I'm going to help people learn botany. I need then to define botany. What is botany? What are the things that I expect my students to achieve? Having identified these clearly and laid them out so that other people can look at them and see that these are appropriate, proper, then I can look critically and carefully at the activities, the experiences. You know, in the early days of audio tutorial, I used to call it an integrated experience approach to teaching botany. And I wish I never had changed the name. In fact, I wrote a little book, it was kind of a little booklet called Integrated Experience Approach to learning botany. Well, that I think expresses much better than audio tutorial the concept of what we're talking about. But as I began talking about integrated experience approach to learning botany, many of my colleagues felt so threatened by the fact that students would be learning by themselves and what they were doing that in kind of self-defense I came up with, well, I do believe that the most important single factor in a learning system is a teacher. I think their teacher is very important. And to try to emphasize that I felt the teacher was important, I said, well, maybe my colleagues will be pleased with the idea of tutoring. So I used the term tutoring. And audio was simply to convey the connotation of storing the tutor in a vehicle so that that tutor could be retrieved at the demand, if you please, of the student or whomever might need this information.
You make this distinction, and I'm going to pursue it a little if I can with you, about the delivery of instruction and, if I can put one word on it, the design of instruction. And I think maybe I'd like for each of you to respond to the kind of question that I would have about that, which is, how do you see these two roles? Are they compatible, and which is more important? You know, and I think maybe that each of us ought to explore that kind of a question.
Well, if learning must be done by the learner, then the design of the instruction ought to involve the learner in the process. Now that's not very profound, but it just seems to me that follows here. I'm saying again that delivery of information may be a part of involving people in the learning process, and people can sit and be involved by hearing information delivered. So that, you see, means that a lecture can be okay, and it can be right here. But most of us who are in the profession of education have become so accustomed to education as being a delivery process that we don't ask these other questions. So much so that, and just to emphasize my point, now I have teaching assistants, and bless their hearts, they are the people who make me or break me, and I appreciate them very, very much because they work hard for me. I really appreciate them. Occasionally I get one who comes to my learning center and to participate in my program because he says he wants to learn how to teach. All right. I put him in a learning center where students are constantly coming to him and saying, hey, I don't understand this, or I don't understand this. It isn't very long until that instructor comes to me and says, look, I came to you because I wanted to learn how to teach, and all I'm doing is just helping these students who are in trouble, who don't understand. Well, I'm saying to that person, you don't understand either. Sick people are those who need a doctor, not people who are well. And by the same token, people who don't know or don't understand are the people who need teachers. Those people who know and understand are the people who need teachers. Now think with me here. This person who came to learn how to teach believed, I'm sure, that teaching was to learn how to deliver information better. Here. Well, I'm saying that on this one-to-one kind of arrangement that he has in the learning center, this is a good opportunity for that person to then talk with an individual, bring in new materials, to test your creativity and skill in helping that person learn. Now, the thing that you have always is the student who is, I don't know, how shall I put this delicately here, but the person who doesn't learn fast. And so indeed, all day long, somebody in the learning center will be dealing with the person who's having a little more difficulty understanding. And consequently, that doesn't give you the same feeling of success, I guess, as a teacher. And so what happens is that you, having spent 2 hours or 3 hours doing this, you feel a bit of frustration because you know the subject matter well, and the people whom you're trying to help really don't know the subject matter that well. And you've done your best explanation, they still don't know it, and since it's a one-to-one situation, the light doesn't light up. And you realize that you have been a failure as a teacher because you're face-to-face with this. In a big general assembly hall, or even in a smaller setting where you have only 20 students, indeed, you can make a presentation and you'll see some lights light up there and you'll feel successful. Whereas the system now selects out those people who need help, and you're working with them.
I'm not sure that I pinned you down on design versus delivery, but I'm going to ask Dave to comment on the concept of the two and where he sees the faculty member fitting in.
Well, I would begin where Sam started with that you're there to try to help people to learn. And so what you want to do is provide everything that you can think of that will make it easy for them. Now, some students will want some type of thing, some students want another. Some will need lectures and some won't. Some need textbooks and some don't need them as badly as others or don't use them as much. So my philosophy basically is that I try to provide everything I can get a hold of for the students. In other words, a proliferation of options, you might call it. And so when I sit down to design a course that I will deliver in various ways, that I have that in mind. I try to use everything I can. So that's the reason I use textbooks, I give a few lectures, I put lectures on videotapes, I use film loops, I use computer terminals with physics simulations on the computer terminals since I'm in the physics department. And I will use microcomputers when I can get the department to buy me one. In fact, I think I can use the microcomputers to help me integrate all these things eventually. So that's delivery then is just a matter of trying to put all these things together and make them available to the students in the way that's best for them. That's a difficult job because theoretically, every student would need some different combination than others. And it requires a lot of organization, a lot of hard work. And it gets tiring sometimes after 2 or 3 years of it, and you think, well, I think I'll just go back to lecturing. It's a lot easier.
You too.
I think your comment makes it a good springboard for what I expect maybe Bill would have to say on this topic.
I just love hearing these guys because both Sam and Dave are saying things that I really approve of. But I find myself asking related but a little bit different questions. And my professional experience has always been the fact that people would come to me and say, what's the best media to use for something? And it always puzzled me, because I didn't have a good answer for them. Some things, because they required motion, seemed to require a film or television. Other things, because they needed sound, required an audio tape. But I really didn't have, beyond that, a good blanket answer to people, other than the fact, well, it's easier for you to use it. I've gotten into this notion through Joe Hill of Oakland Community College, who is now no longer with us, but Joe was working with educational cognitive style, and it rang a real bell with me because now all of a sudden I had some good answers for people. Because we talk about including the student in the design of instruction in the realist sense. Dave, you may be an inductive learner, and Sam a deductive. And Roberts, he may like to learn by himself, and the other two in small groups, and maybe myself in a large lecture hall. There are lots and lots of variables that make up the characteristics of the individual. And so what we're talking about is measuring those variables and then turning to the person designing instruction, helping them by knowing the student better to actually decide, no, we're not going to use just audio tapes or a slide tape or a film strip or a videotape. In fact, we may find that between a videotape and a slide tape there's very little difference. Maybe there's more difference between two videotapes because of the intrinsic qualities that relate to the student. And I wish we could say we've got the answer to all that, but right now I've been working about 5 years trying to design a test for upper division university students, which would pull those variables out. I got some significant differences just recently, but nothing yet to report is great.
Well, and until these researchers come up with something that will help you pick your students for the right mini course and that sort of thing, I suppose you're probably going to keep on revising and building. Mini course is the term you use, isn't it?
Yes, we talk about many courses, and of course that's my...
Those are really just modules, though.
Well, we can get into an argument about which is the best term here directly, but important here, it seems to me, is, again, that the vehicles we're talking about, videotape, movies, textbooks, or whatever, are only quality if indeed the person who did them put things in there that made them quality.
Are you talking about content?
I'm talking not only about content. I'm talking about instructional design as well. Some people can write in such a way that you can understand what they're saying. Other people, including, well, I'm not going to mention them, but there are people who write so that you can't understand what they're saying. And most of us who write textbooks write for colleagues and not for the students who are to understand these. So again, content is important, but it's only one aspect of communication. And videotape its quality is dependent on what is done in front of the camera and the quality or the technicians that operate the cameras. So videotape is nothing in and of itself. It's a series of images and audio that is stored so that you can retrieve it whenever you want. And so I think we have to get our concept right here. What we're doing is trying to store a human being in such a way that that human being can be retrieved. And you see, there are good books and there are bad books. There are good lectures and there are bad lectures. And we tend to lump them all together, and somebody gets on the drum, you know, and beats the drum for saying that lectures are all bad. That isn't so, because a good lecture makes something that's really worthwhile for many people. And now, I don't know what this does, Bill, in terms of looking at the learning styles. There are a couple of things that I think are of concern here. One is that suppose you find that the learning style is better through a lecture for somebody, then indeed we've got to assume that all lectures are of the same quality here, which we can't assume. And if you have a bad lecture, it may be that a good textbook is much better than a bad lecture. I also wonder sometimes if indeed I learn better from a textbook, if I ought to train myself to live in this world by learning from a videotape sometimes, that I really ought to avail myself of a number of different kinds of learning experiences rather than a single one.
You're raising a good... Let me interrupt here. Sure. You're raising a good point that I did not make, because we fully recognize that when we want people to learn, we may play on their strengths so that they will learn X amount of information. But on the other hand, we also recognize that sometimes it's necessary to augment a person's learning style, so that, in fact, if you are weak on reading, maybe we ought to beef you up there. I don't. The dimensions that the notions that I'm talking about add to, let's say, your possibilities. If you're, let's say, shopping around trying to buy a set of materials, recognizing the fact that there are deductive and inductive materials, recognizing that there are learners who prefer to read, others who prefer to listen, etc., would then help you perceive the world of materials in a different light, rather than going out and buying a film strip or a videotape or something like this and thinking that's different, because there may not, in fact, be intrinsic qualities that are different between the pieces of material. We're also getting into another notion, and that is of preferences as opposed to capabilities.
Yeah.
On the K, let's say, through junior college system, we're talking about, is the learner capable? When we get into the university system, hopefully we're not always quite so sure about this anymore. Everybody that's in the university is a fairly capable learner, and the farther up they go in the system, the more capable they should be. Therefore, we begin to talk about, well, how would they prefer to learn? With the notion being that if I can associate the learning that I intend for them to have with a pleasant environment, that is a learning environment, then their attitude about that material will be much more positive. They're more likely to believe what I say. They're more likely to go out and practice what I say. And that seems to me to be of something of value.
You're
well
opening
said.
up the whole humanistic kind of thing that's involved here, and I wanted to get to that. And then actually I wanted to get to it from the other side, which was to ask the flat-out question, how do you respond to those people who say to you, you've devised this system, and I think that it does violence to humanistic concerns, or some such question?
Yeah.
Do you get that question?
Very often, and I think they just don't understand what they're talking about. They haven't looked at the system. They haven't seen that indeed in the design of our instructional system, we want to provide students an opportunity to interact with one another, and this does occur. On the other hand, we do find that some students don't want to interact with other students, and we do provide that, we allow the student to be their own, we assume that they're mature, and if indeed they are paying their money to go to college, they will want to carry away from college all the information that, I'm saying this with tongue in cheek, that they are, all that they want to, and they want to get their money's worth. But audio tutorial in no way leaves out the human aspect. Learning is a human-to-human phenomenon, and we see it all of the time. And all of us are standing on the shoulders of the people who came before us. And again, isn't it a marvelous trait that human beings can take the information that is accumulated and start from there and go from there? Otherwise, the progress, we have no progress. And so it is a human-to-human thing, and we still have our big old lecture where I go in there and just smile and smile all I know how to say I love botany, and I think plants are fantastic. Don't you? Shake your head yes. So indeed, I also try to memorize the names of my students so that I can call them by name. I'm not as successful as I'd like to be with this, but we start with it and really work at it.
Dave, do you get any vibrations on the humanistic question?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, quite often. I tell my friends who do nothing but lecture that I have more contact with my students than they do.
Do they believe you?
Well, they seem to not believe me, but I then ask them to come and view for themselves. I think you've been there, and you know that's the case. You deal with them personally. You don't deal with them en masse. And to me, that's much more humanistic than dealing with 120 students or 40 students. Even with 120 students in a PSI course, you still can deal with each one of them personally once or twice during the term, whereas you may only deal with 10, 15, or 20 in a regular lecture course. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't lecture, and I agree with what Sam said a while ago, that sometimes lecturing is an excellent way to get across material. I can remember 2 lectures I had through my education that were terrific. You know, I wouldn't have wanted them to teach in any other way than that particular way. And but others, I would have wished that they had done something else. And so I think it's not only the way the student learns, but it's also the way a professor can get the material across. One professor may not be able to get it across so well in lectures, but he may do a beautiful job with some other way of doing it. And so I think you have to factor both sides, and it's the humanistic thing again, because you've got humans interacting with humans, and you've got to then take all the factors involved in all those humans, including the people that are designing the system and trying to do delivery. So it's a complicated problem, and I'm not saying about your possibilities of putting it all down on paper and saying these are the rules, everybody abide by them, because I don't think that it's that easy.
But it's significant that you said you had 2 lecturers here, I
Two.
think, of the group that...
One undergraduate, one graduate school.
And your contact now with your student is a much more meaningful contact. And then coming back to Bill's point here, we have made an assumption that an exchange between a professor and a student is going to be a pleasant exchange. That is an assumption. Students, we professors have personalities too that conflict with the students' personalities, and we may any contact that I have in a very direct way may be negative rather than positive.
Some
from
would be
the standpoint
frightened
of
to
the
death of you
Exactly.
and would learn much better from a peer.
And in that situation, what we've created is more tension and anxiety,
Right.
and not really had a pleasant exchange. In that situation, however, with that student might identify in a large lecture hall and feel more at ease and learn to know a professor.
Aren't we almost back to the success thing that we started with?
Yeah, well, in a sense, you're talking about the large lecture hall. Maybe the most successful students there were the ones who went to the faculty member's office. And there he had one-to-one contact with the faculty member. That was what he needed. He was self-selecting his own learning style. And the other might have gotten a better learning situation out of meeting with their colleagues for coffee after class. And some of them just didn't do anything at all, and they were the ones who fell by the wayside.
Well, most of us feel like we are good lecturers. I think that nearly every teacher that I encounter feels that they have something special to give students in a lecture hall that nobody else can give it in quite the same way. So there's a little delusion there, I think, on the part of some of us who lecture, but also on the part of some students too, because they've been conditioned for many, many years. And now, Dave, what yours, a 3-hour course or 4?
It's a 3-hour course.
A 3-hour course. Now, when you think of trying to have impact on somebody's life with a 3-hour credit course, and they have a whole history of I don't know how many years here of previous exposure to a system which they equate with education or learning, and you're going counter to this, then you ought to expect, I think, that you would have some negative reactions by those students, and that to have much impact on the way they learn in just taking that little segment of their lives is asking an awful lot of the instructional design and of the instructor as well.
Yeah. The surprising thing to me has been the small amount of negative reaction there is. I would have thought there would be more, because as you say, they're so used to the other type of teaching, and
Yes.
all of a sudden you're hitting them with something new here in their senior year. They've never seen it before.
Yeah.
Don't you get negative reactions when it comes to grading or the level of difficulty? And I think maybe that's something that the people who watch programs like this ought to know, is that it isn't easier
Oh no,
to do your kind of thing or to do Sam's kind of thing.
it's harder on the professor and it's harder on the student, I think, both. Because the student, you design the system for mastery, your high level of mastery as you can maintain. And the normal lecture courses are really not designed for mastery.
Right.
And so when you're going to require that they master, it means they have to work like the devil.
Yeah.
And you know, people don't like to work. That's one negative aspect of the system, is that people don't like to work. Now, the positive aspect is when they do it and they have a success. That's wonderful, and they're told that they're great. That's wonderful too. But the fact that they had to work so hard to do it is negative. But you can't get around that. If you're going to accomplish something, you have to work.
Yeah, you see, that is something that a lot of students don't understand. And even our whole instructional system is designed around a curve-type grading, which suggests to students that all is relative and that you can half know something.
Mm-hmm.
And if you half know it, that might be an A in some courses. And here we are coming in now with a whole different concept, saying, no, you're not going to half know, you're going to whole know. You're going to know it all. And you need to know it 100% or you don't pass this. Well, of all of the things that I'm criticized in my course by my students, that is the one thing that I get my lowest rating on, and that is unfairness of grading, because they consider it not fair to have to know subject matter.
It's revolutionary.
Well, I think that maybe we can sort of terminate it on that, because that's a provocative thought to carry us forward. And I certainly thank all of the participants here today, Bill Terrell, Sam Postlethwait, and Dave Roper. Thank you very much.
Turn the lights on.